My dad served in the Vietnam War from 1960 to 1962. For the longest time, he didn't tell anyone outside of the family this story. But he's in his mid 80s now. He doesn't care about me sharing it with anyone, not that I intend to release any of our names. I've heard this story told by him 5 times now, and each time I learn about new details he hadn't mentioned the time. Before, he didn't like to tell the story for obvious reason. I think not only is thinking back to any of those events probably traumatizing, but also he would always say he felt it would be an inappropriate family gathering discussion. My dad did a lot of things in the war at one point. He was what was known as a tunnel rat, which was a soldier who performed underground search and destroy missions, usually in underground tunnels. My dad and two of his comrades were crawling through a deep tunnel, expecting to hit a booby trap or run into an ambush, but the tunnels were surprisingly empty and silent. My dad describes the experience of crawling through the silent dark tunnels as bone chilling and adrenaline pumping as the fear of instant death at any moment would linger. My dad and his comrades hear a faint yelling and crying sound further down the tunnels. It was of a woman. As they crawled deeper into the tunnels, the cries and screams became more clear. It was obvious there was a woman screaming for help. The three picked up their pace, worried of a potential hostage or prisoner situation. As they continued to crawl through the tunnels, the cries for help got a little louder and clearer. They arrived to a small room that they could slightly get off their knees in. The ceiling was just high enough to half stand, half crouch. There was a small table with a lantern on it that was still lit. There were also two broken chairs in a locked safe box with some metallic objects that would wrestle around inside the box. When shaken aside from that, this small room was empty. However, the tunnel continued past this room. So they continued deeper into the tunnel, but the screams for help had stopped at this point. My dad described this horrible familiar stench of death that soon became overwhelming in the tunnels. They entered one final room with no further tunnels. My dad still refuses to describe everything that was in this room in detail, other than there were multiple bodies. They were not killed by just bullets. They looked as though they had been mutilated by some kind of creature. One of the bodies was that of a woman. The scene was so horrible that my dad and the two other tunnels rats had to turn around and flee. They had no explanation for what could have done. What was seen in that room when they crawled back out of the tunnels? They started hearing the cries for help from that woman's voice again. My dad says he and his comrades froze and looked at each other with wide eyes and obvious fear in their faces. They had made it to the end of that tunnel. There were no living things from there to the end of it, yet those screams for help were coming from the direction that they picked up. Their pace even more. My dad was in the back of the group of three, and he says he would look back every 10 seconds thinking he was hearing sound from behind him. Fearing he would see someone or something approaching from the darkness, they made it back to the surface eventually and marked the entrance with a flag that signified to his team that the tunnel had been searched and cleared. Most tunnels would be interconnecting as a means of underground transportation and cover, but my dad says this tunnel was unusual to abruptly end. He says it was easily the most gut-wrenching, horrific, nightmare-inducing thing he'd experienced in his entire 2 years in Wyoming. My basic training for the Air Force was at Lakeland Air Force Base in San Antonio, Texas. After that, I was sent to Shepherd Air Force Base for technical school, and after my graduation, I received order to McGuire Air Force Base in New Jersey. There, my job was aerospace mechanic. At first, I started on the night duty, unfortunately, so my sleep schedule was basically non existent. My duties basically were lugging plane parts like anti-ice values, anti-ice valves, igniters, ignitions, exciters, sensors, and more from the warehouse to the flight line. It was for the most part boring, repetitive work, especially at night, a lot of sitting around and playing games on my phone, but nobody heard that. For me, it had to be like 4 a.m. At this point, I was waiting for the other guy to come drop off some parts to the flight line. He'll be referred to as Mark for the purpose of this story. I was waiting by the back cargo area for the plane we were working on at the time, sitting on a box scrolling through my phone. Mark was taking an incredibly long time with his delivery, so I shot him a few texts. When they went unresponded to, I tried calling him a few times. The calls rang 4 times, then went to voicemail. I figured he was either screening his calls, lost his phone, or was just very busy at the moment. I waited, and he never showed up. Eventually, I got a call from Mark's number, so I picked up, but it wasn't Mark's voice. On the other end, it was some random guy. He sounded like a grown man in his 40s. He said he saw I tried calling a few times and said he found his phone on the ground outside of the base. I described what Mark looked like and asked him if he had seen anyone who may have resembled him. He said he had not. It's not like he would have been a lot on the base, so my only option was to drive out there and meet him. I asked him where he was, and he gave me the name of a nearby joint where I agreed to meet him. I walked to my car, which was parked in the closest parking lot, and I drove off the base towards the place. He told me to meet him while I was mid drive. I remembered Mark was sharing his location with me. Long story, but we basically met these two girls this one night while off base, who we separated from each other. We as a joke started sharing our locations with each other in case we got caught and caught murder. As we kept joking, we joked about it mainly because we met them at a sketchy dive bar, but I'm not about to get into that. The place the man on the phone told me to meet him was called Tara's Tavern in Cookstown, the closest town to the base. I pulled up the location of Mark's phone and it checked out. It showed Mark's phone location right next to Tara's Tavern. This begged the question.